If you would like to be represented in this critique, if you'd like your work to be critiqued, make sure that you email me images. Earlier than Thursday is ideal, and you can email those images to Dabbleon, Dabbleon, Dabbleon at gmail.com. And a couple high quality images. The better the image is, the better I will be able to see it and discuss it. So if you could get good light on it and take, even with your phone, should be fine. I can do a little bit of cropping and manipulation after the fact, but the better the image is, the better I can critique. Couple other things. One thing that I wanted to mention, I have been reading this book by Jeff Tweedy. I don't if you are not familiar with Jeff Tweedy, he's in a band called Wilco. He's a lead singer, and he wrote a book that I'm reading. I'm actually listening to, called "How to Write One Song." It's a fairly recently published. Anyway, I'm a huge Wilco fan, have been for years, and was interested to hear what he had to say. It's a really short book. It's only 3 hours on audio, so I imagine it's just a very quick read. But it's always really interesting to me to hear the creative process of other media or other disciplines, and to see the kind of overlap, see how the vocabulary being used is very similar to what I teach in my classes, and similar to my experience as a visual artist. The way he talks about making songs is very similar to the way I think about making art. The things that he warns against, the stumbling blocks, the ways, the negative internal dialogue, the ways that we keep ourselves from starting and just making artwork, the ways we build up in our minds what should and shouldn't be. There's a lot of crossover, and I just find it fascinating and very instructive to see how these different principles, these different ideas, are carried out in a different context, to see these ideas through a different lens. So anyway, short story is I think you should go out and take a look at this book. It's very interesting. Again, called "How to Write One Song" by Jeff Tweedy. And I think you probably just insert how to paint one painting. I think it's just the things that he talks about, I think, are just as applicable to the creative process behind making images. So I would check that out. And similarly, I think Stephen King, author, has a book called On Writing, which I also found very, very interesting and instructive, looking at the creative process through the lens of a writer, an author, and talking about just the logistics of the everyday, what it means to be a writer, what it means to just start writing, even if you're not feeling inspiration. Anyway, and then just the craft, talking about some of just how authors think about putting together words is also applicable and relevant to what we're doing as studio artists. So that's another book I would recommend. And then obviously, while I'm recommending books, I'll throw out The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, also an author, and he discusses creativity in terms of authorship, writing, but it is also very relevant to what we do as visual artists. Okay, so I have 3 images that I'm going to talk about today. From students in my current mixed media class. Another short item of business, I will be opening registration for the next 5-week class that I'll be teaching online. More details will be coming this week. Actually, it's already Thursday. So either if I don't get details posted by tomorrow, then early next week, for registration and more details about what the class is all about. It is going to be a class focusing on using resin So epoxy resin, if you're interested in using epoxy resin in combination with collage or with painting, I'm going to be discussing that. And I think there's a lot more that resin is capable of than we generally think it's capable of. Usually we think of it as just a finishing glossy coat. But really, there is so much more we can do with it, and I'm excited to share that information with you. All right, so what I'm talking about today, I have three images from one of the students in my current class. I'm going to switch over here to, whoops, there we go. I'm going to switch over here to my screen, and this is Photoshop. And let's take a look at what we've got. I'm going to back out a little bit. So I'm also having some computer issues that for some reason my computer doesn't want to do photoshopping and broadcasting and video capture and all of these things at the same time. Totally understandable. And hopefully I will have that taken care of before next Thursday. But I do apologize at how kind of sluggish my computer is working at the moment. Okay, so I've got this image, and then I have the same image, and maybe before I dig into, I don't know, actually, maybe let me talk about this one first, and then we'll go back to this one. The only difference between the two is that when the artist was taking a picture of the image, she got a shadow of her hand cast on the image over here. So she kind of liked how that worked, kind of liked that shadow breaking up this floor area, and asked if that might be a good thing to pursue and include. And I do have a couple thoughts on that. But before we get to that, let's look at this image, which I think is actually a bit of a better exposure. It looks like we have more saturated colors and more even lighting. So this is better. I'm going to crop it real quick, a little bit more. Should have done this before I started, because I think we're getting just a little bit of extra background information. Okay, so basically what we're seeing is collage. This, I know from previous versions, the foreground figure on the right, it was a photograph of a person that she painted on top of, to the point where we can see very little of the photograph remaining. And then we've got a lot of different kinds of collage elements in the background, composed in a way that invokes an interior space, right? We've got these converging orthogonals, these lines of linear perspective that lead us back into the distance or into this internal space. Then we have these rectangles in the wall that appear to be windows that are looking out onto a scene. We have some kind of consistent image that extends beyond or in both windows. It looks like that's a single outside as opposed to having two different kinds of images. It's the same scene, the same colors, the same aesthetic. There's kind of a cartoon quality of this stuff in the windows. Okay, so that's kind of what we've got. We've got linear perspective, we've got an interior space, we've got collage, we've got this guy in the foreground off to the right. Now, I guess first thing that I want to do is just to respond to what I'm seeing and what I'm getting, what the message to me is. And having this person in the extreme foreground, it feels like a portrait, but if it was just a straightforward portrait where I was meant to just look at the person, the person's features, it was just a presentation of this person. If that was all I was meant to get, then I would assume that more of the person's face would be included in the image, right? I wouldn't get this the right, my right, his left side of the face cropped off, and I wouldn't have that shoved over so much to one side with a lot more negative space being shown, right? So the reason I bring this up is because just the positioning of the person, of this person in the picture, is telling me that there is something else going on here that I'm supposed to be paying attention to, or that I'm supposed to be getting from it. The positioning where he's kind of framing on one edge what's happening in the background, right? So I don't get the feeling that I'm supposed to stop and pay my most attention to him. He's kind of part of the context of the scene. He's important. Obviously, he's in the foreground. He's closest to me. He occupies a fairly large portion of the composition, but he's not where I'm supposed to end up. Where I'm supposed to end up, I kind of the way, especially with the way she's included these perspective lines, they're kind of going on top of that picture and leading me back into the distance. She wants me to go back here into the distance. There's something back here. I've got a lot of really interesting visual information up here in the ceiling area. I've got a lot of interesting textural information in the floor, and that seems to intensify as I get further back. So, all to say that interesting portrait, don't, I feel like that's important context, but I'm being led into the distance. And I am focusing on this because I'm not entirely sure where I'm being led to, or what I'm supposed to, where I'm supposed to end. So I've got a couple competing things that are competing for my attention. Because there is a natural vanishing point implied by these lines of linear perspective on the tops and bottoms of the walls, the vanishing point would be somewhere kind of pretty much eye level with the guy in the foreground, which is a good call because that ties him to this perspective logic of the interior space. Doesn't feel like he's, like pasted on after the fact, and we have a mismatch of perspective. So that's good. But what am I looking at back here? Where am I going? Let me bring up, let me get a paintbrush real quick and see if I can get a bright color so I can talk about this a little bit better. So the vanishing point is kind of somewhere right there. I know because, if I were to follow these lines and they were to following to where they converge, right? And these lines ought to also converge on the same vanishing point. So not super precise, but yeah, some are, I'll just draw this. This is kind of where my eye is led to by the perspective. So naturally, I've got a very strong pull to that corner. Do I feel like the corner is where I'm meant to end up? No. And I don't necessarily have to just rely on those perspective lines to indicate where I'm supposed to land. That can just get me to kind of the general area of the composition that the artist wants me to land. I do see there's an anomalous thing happening here on the wall. There's this line drawing, which is very visually interesting. It's high contrast line. It's isolated. There's not a whole lot of other stuff going on around it. Whereas over here, I do have a lot of interesting information, but it's more kind of just generally distributed. I don't have kind of one place to land over here. So I kind of feel like this is, first maybe I go to this natural focal point at the vanishing point, and then starts going over here. I kind of play with that a little bit, look at that for a little while, and then I think I probably end up over here. I notice that it's an apple on a tree, and with hands reaching toward it. Whenever you have an apple on a tree with hands reaching toward it, it's going to evoke Adam and Eve. I think no matter, or at least maybe in American culture, I should say, I think it's so pervasive a story in our culture, regardless of your religion. I think the whole notion of Adam and Eve and the apple in the garden is probably common enough a story that it's going to be impossible to get around. The only other thing that I can think of maybe is Isaac Newton with the apple dropping off the tree, hitting him in the head, and that's kind of how launches Newtonian physics or whatever. So it could be that this guy up in the foreground is Isaac Newton or has something to do with Isaac Newton, but that's not kind of my initial read. My initial read is that this is about something to do with the Adam and Eve narrative, or something tying into that kind of original sin, partaking of the fruit in the garden type thing. And the way that there's a consistency of that image in both those windows kind of leads me to believe that that's the narrative here. right? That's the story that I'm supposed to be connecting two dots. I'm connecting this guy in the foreground with this Adam and Eve narrative in the background. So generally speaking, I think you've done an excellent job of you obviously framing that in the window. You're using the vanishing point, these perspective lines to lead us back there. I think if there's one thing that I would say though is I think I would de-emphasize some of this really aggressive, busy information in the ceiling, especially because I think there's just a lot to pull me up there that I don't necessarily think is an intentional focal point, or I don't think that that's helping strengthen what the message is. Right. So anytime we have a unintended focal point or something that's pulling us away from what seems to be the implied narrative or what I'm supposed to be getting from it, that starts to make me think, or kind of creates this feeling that there's something about this that I need to be paying attention to. But then when I get there, there's nothing obvious or clear to me about how this adds to this connection between the foreground figure and the apple on the tree. So that's why I say de-emphasize when something is pulling my attention away from what I believe is the intended narrative. I think that could be a problem. So de-emphasize that, and then how could we make perhaps this, I don't know, I think maybe it gets lost a little bit, especially competing with this line drawing. I like the line drawing on the wall. I like that it ties aesthetically. This is kind of a cartoony line drawing, and that ties in with this line drawing in the outside. And maybe that's a nice transition from this more kind of traditionally representational type of rendering into a more stylized, cartoony aesthetic. Maybe that's a nice kind of attachment there. But I don't know. So I don't know. I'm kind of conflicted on that. I like it, but maybe it could be de-emphasized, or maybe we could do something to emphasize that right there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to do this quickly so I don't belabor the point. But what if I just select this wall? All right. And then I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to fill that layer just with black. I'm going to create a multiply layer and then adjust opacity. So I'm just going to make that darker, the whole wall. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another selection that's just that window. And this is kind of quick and dirty. I'm not, and I'm making this up as I go along, so don't take this too seriously. Whoops. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete out the window there. Command delete. So what I've done is I've de-emphasized this line drawing here by decreasing the contrast between that black line and the surface that it's on, right? By decreasing or by making the rest of the wall darker value, there's less contrast between the black of the line drawing and the wall, right? It also has the effect of making the image in the background, this cartoon, feel lighter in value because this now is comparatively darker, right? So it's helping this to kind of feel like, well, it's in a lighter context. So maybe it's outside. It's obviously in direct sunlight. We get the highlights and shadows on the trees. So it feels lighter because it's not competing with the lightness of this wall, which gets pretty close to white, right? So it's creating more of a separation of a feeling like this is an internal space with less lighting. This is outside space with direct sunlight. And maybe just to see what happens if I darken that even more, it gets to be where it might be too much. So I think with that, you could accomplish that with a glaze, or you could accomplish that with a, if you wanted to do collage, you could collage on some tissue paper so that when you glue it, it turns transparent and kind of knocks that back a bit. Those would be ways to deal with that. And, just as an experiment, I don't know, maybe I don't want to do that. Because you can see how this wall too gets to be pretty close to white. And you know what? I'm going to do that real quick. So what if I just again, quick and dirty selection here. This is not going to be super precise. So I'm going to select that wall and then do a similar process where I'm just going to fill that in with black. And then I'll change that to a multiply layer, adjust the opacity. So maybe that wall, you know, depending on the light, you know, you got to imagine what's the light logic inside that room. Is more light hitting this wall or more light hitting that wall? Is it being lit evenly? Depending on the perspective of the viewer, one wall might appear to be darker. There's a lot of different factors to take into consideration. And then finally, let me just, again, delete out the window. So now I've made that wall quite a bit darker. So do you notice how I'm starting to, these backgrounds, because I've got more contrast generally between this whole shape and these things outside the window, they are popping out more, right? They're separating out more and they're grabbing our attention more. And these areas are becoming more de-emphasized. Again, I'm not sure exactly how much or what the difference should be between the two walls. Maybe I also like actually how having this wall darker starts to separate the face out from the wall a little bit more. I do like how there's a transition from the face into the wall, the way that line on the jaw gets lost in the color on the wall. But I also like how that starts to separate out and pull the figure forward. Anyway, I think those are just some of the things that I thought looking at this is how could we really clarify or make that background really stand out. I'm going to leave those dark walls in there for now and maybe make my brush a little bit larger and, you know, maybe even a softer, I'm going to make that really soft and maybe just making that line on the edge of the face softer and having a bit more of a transition. Maybe it's lighter here toward the front and then it gets darker as it goes toward the corner. I think that's called ambient occlusion, if I'm not mistaken. As it gets to be where those walls are closer together, it blocks more light from hitting that area. And then obviously you could do the same thing. You could darken the top. I'm not going to do that right now. And you could also play with the lighting on the bottom. But doing these things is going to help those two scenes in the window pop out. The other thing that I can think of that it looks like she did, it looks like she added just a little bit of saturated color right there on the apple. And that might be a good way to go too, is maybe even accentuate that more. If I go, let me just go overboard. My computer is struggling. Go overboard and really add a punch of color right there. That might help. I'm going to do something here that I do not recommend you doing, but it is to make a point. I have that red now on the apple in the background. If I were, for example, to put that red somewhere, you know, you have little punctuations of red elsewhere in the image, but if I were to put that red on or closer to the dude, you know, that's obviously not a good place to put it. I mean, I was thinking the red lips might be in a place that red would make sense. But pattern is a fantastic way to connect two parts of your composition, right? When we have this color repeated back here, our brains, or the viewer's brain, is automatically going to make a connection between those two things. So one way that we can help strengthen what we're trying to say or literally connect the dots for people is by repeating a visual element, by using pattern, repetition to create a connection, to create a visual analog, to create a visual similarity that our viewer can pick up on, right? So there are a lot of different ways that we can create cues besides positioning of the elements. There are, I mean, even just, I'm thinking like, just like you have a line drawing on the wall in the background, you know, a line drawing of the shape of that apple. Let's see, let's go to black. You know, line drawing of the shape of the apple behind this guy maybe would be enough, or like that circular apple shape would be might be enough to make us bring us a connection between that apple shape and then this foreground shape, you know, to help us make that direct link between those two parts of the composition. Anyway, I just wanted to make the point that pattern is a great way to clarify what we're trying to communicate. It can be a literal way to connect parts of the two parts of the composition that are away from each other, that aren't necessarily right next to each other. Okay, so that's enough said on that. I think there's just a tremendous amount of really interesting texture going on here. One point that I made with an image last week that might be worth making again here, and I think I actually made this to the person, this artist. I'm going to make a little, I'm going to pull these perspective lines from the drawing onto another layer so I can make a point. All right, let me turn off the image. Okay, so this is the room perspective lines. The point I want to make here is that the vanishing point, again, is up there somewhere. The closer we get to the vanishing point, these floor shapes are going to appear, generally speaking. You know, you might have different shapes on the floor that aren't necessarily consistent, but generally speaking, any shape on the floor is going to appear to get smaller and narrower or closer together. So, for example, if we had kind of this repeating pattern of stripes, you know, the further away those stripes get from the vanishing point, the bigger they are vertically, and the further apart they're spaced, right? So that is relevant here because even though this pattern of cardboard shapes doesn't necessarily reflect a pattern on the floor of this interior space, that's generally what we expect to see. That things on the ground, the closer they are to the foreground, the wider those are going to be, and the more space is going to be between those spots on the floor generally. So as it gets closer to the vanishing point, those stripes of information vertically are going to get closer together, and they're going to get shorter vertically, or narrower vertically. So I think my eye kind of goes to that. I think she actually made an adjustment there and did do more of that. And I think it did get better in that regard. But even now, there is a consistency in the size or in the spacing that kind of, well, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's these little stripes right there in these foreground things. The way those stripes of background information are all fairly similar. Anyway, so that's something you just don't want to unintentionally draw attention to, this floor space when it starts to contradict the linear perspective that you've very clearly established in the top and bottom of the walls. Okay, enough with this image. I think it's fantastic. I love a lot of the stuff that's going on here. I think, if anything, just this connection of the meaning that I'm supposed to, you're trying to apply to me. What is the connection between this foreground figure and this stuff that you're framing in the windows and leading me to with a linear perspective? All right, let's go back to this other version. She has this shadow of her hand and her pinky sticking out there. So I do like how that shadow divides up this floor shape into two more interesting shapes, right? That's an interesting division of that floor shape. The thing that I would like to caution here is kind of what I was just saying about the floor thing, is that you want to make sure that what you're doing in these elements that you're adding to your composition, that they don't contradict the linear perspective that you are implying, or the relationship or the light logic that you're establishing with the way you're rendering this internal space. So if you have this shape on the floor, it looks like a shadow being cast, right? Because all of these colors and these textures and these shapes continue consistently right across that floor. And the only difference between right here and right here is that it's a bit darker, which implies that either it's a big stain on the floor or a shadow is being cast. So if you want it to appear just as a coloration, like a stain, or something caused this part of the floor to be a slightly different color, again, when it's on the floor, it's gonna to me it's gonna read like a stain, because it looks like it's the same floor, it's just a little bit darker. If you want it to feel like it's a shadow being cast on that floor, then we need to have that shadow also interacting with this wall, which is right next to the floor, right? If a big object was casting a shadow on the floor right here, it would also logically be casting a shadow on this wall right there. Then I've got a helicopter, sounds like flying right above my head. So hopefully that is not as loud for you as it is for me. So if you are going to keep, or if you want to introduce that, and you could by masking that area off with tape or with Frisket, not liquid, but Frisket film, I would also suggest, if you want it to feel like a shadow, that you have some kind of shadow also happening up here. So let me try to do that really quickly by making a selection, and maybe that shadow might again, this is going to be a little bit messy, but hopefully we'll make my point. I'm going to fill that in with kind of a brown color that might look similar to what's happening on the floor. So fill that in with this brown, decrease opacity, make it a multiply layer. And anyway, that's probably close enough, right? Deselect that and maybe erase some of this out so it looks a little bit more how I intended. These edges might not be so sharp. I don't know if that would be the right shadow being cast. Obviously, it's going to depend on what is casting the shadow. Is it him or is it something behind him? I don't know. But again, if you don't want this, I like that division. I agree with you that that is kind of an interesting way to divide up that floor space and activates that, makes it a little bit more interesting. But if you don't want it to appear like a stain on the floor, then you need to have some kind of consistent light logic where that whatever's casting that shadow is also interacting with this wall and casting a shadow on that wall. All right, so I think that's enough with that image in general, and let me go to this final image. And this is an image that we've talked about in class, and I am not going to get too much more. I'm not going to revisit the stuff that we talked about in class. I thought there would be a couple other things that I might mention here. One, I think it's worth looking at this image as a black and white. So value contrast refers to light and dark contrast, the spectrum of white all the way to black. And every color has a relative value, right? So if you have pink and blue, if you took a black and white photograph of that pink, it's going to belong somewhere on that spectrum from black to white. And same with the blue, right? If you take another picture of that pink, it's going to be the same shade of gray, right? It's always going to have that direct correlation to a gray on the gray scale, or black or white if you've got a really light value or dark value, right? And the reason this is important is because value contrast, or light and dark contrast, is one of the strongest kind of contrasts, the most impactful in our visual perception and how we read imagery. So sometimes it's helpful to get rid of color information, because color information is really enticing on kind of a psychological and emotional level, to get rid of that and just look at an image in terms of light and dark contrast and see what's happening there. So in this case, looking at this just in terms of value, I've got this area of dark value kind of right here in the foreground. And it's generally this whole shape. There's kind of a landscape quality to this image, even though it is, mostly abstract. But there's this, keep on doing that. There's this foreground shape that's dark. This negative space around that shape is dark. And then we've got this repeated texture of lines that's not as dark as that foreground one, but comes closer. So if we want to invoke more of a sense of landscape, of three-dimension, of space, of recession into the z-axis, into depth, we can invoke something called the atmospheric perspective. And that's literally like when there's more atmosphere in the air, things in the far distance appear to be lighter value, less saturated, and fuzzy, right? Because the way that light is interacting with those water droplets in the air, it's making it scatter more, right? So we get this kind of diffuse haze where the distant objects get kind of blurry, and we've got that white haze in between us and it, so it appears to be lighter value and less saturated. So we can invoke some of that. For example, if I were to take the Dodge tool here and make it a bit bigger, and make this area, that's too much. Let me decrease the exposure strength on that. Make this area even lighter, and I'm just lightening the shadows. And then make this foreground, I'm going to use the burn tool now to make the foreground even darker, right? So we're going to get this more of a sense of atmospheric perspective, of atmosphere in the air that's separating us by space, or accentuating the fact that there's a separation of space, right? Or the illusion of space. Anyway, we can kind of tap into that to create a feeling of spaciousness by generally adding more dark value in this foreground and more lighter value in this distant. That would be a way to kind of invoke, again, a sense of landscape, which I feel is happening here. The other thing that I wanted to point out with just looking at in terms of value, let's see, take out that saturation, is just that the majority of this composition is kind of in those mid grays. There's little punctuations where, especially on these torn edges of the paper, where it gets to white. And there are little areas in the creases of this texture that gets to be almost black, but really the majority of this is a fairly narrow range of values in the middle of the grayscale. Not necessarily a problem, but if you want things to pop more, if you want them to stand out more, it's not just an issue of color, right? You can try to put complementary pairs in there to make more contrast. But what's going to be more influential if you want things to pop more in this image is by creating more value contrast. So it doesn't matter what color. Color's great, and it can be used to create contrast and more pop by using complementary colors. But what's going to be more effective in creating that contrast and that pop is creating more value contrast, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Right now, there's not, generally speaking, the overall values. There's not a lot of value contrast happening here, especially in the negative space. All right, the next thing that I wanted to talk or to notice here in this image is if I were to go to filter and down to blur and Gaussian blur, I can affect how blurry this image gets. So let me take the blur down a little bit. So this is a practice that art teachers will often say is try to unfocus your eyes, try to blur your eyes. We can just do that a little bit more literally and easier in Photoshop. So what that does is it takes away all the surface detail that catches our attention and distracts us from being able to see what's happening on a more global level, right? It's kind of the difference between the chop on the surface of the ocean that is going to grab our attention because it's annoying and it's right there in front of our face, as opposed to the currents that are under the surface of the ocean, right? That, if we're swimming in the ocean, that chop might be really distracting and catching our attention, getting in our mouth and our eyes. But what's really affecting where we're going and moving, maybe that riptide has pulled us, a mile away when we're swimming our fastest and being annoyed by the surface chop. Anyway, I don't need to dig too much into that metaphor, but hopefully that's understandable. So taking away, by blurring this, I'm taking away some of that surface detail and the texture and all the stuff that we get interested in, and hopefully see a little bit better what's happening on that kind of tide level, the undercurrent, the foundation. And what we can see is there again, there's this kind of mountain foreground element, and this flow or this line of negative space, the blue sky, and it feels like blue sky. So I don't know if that is intentional, but that's the way it comes across. So that this is what I follow. I follow that light shape in that line that happens, that flows from left to right over here. And really where I'm ending up or where I feel like I'm landing is right here, right? Generally speaking, English speakers, we read images like we read text from left to right. And I feel like I'm being guided by the organization of these visual elements, and the way that the concentration of information in this foreground element is kind of dense and I don't know, dense is kind of locks me out kind of that shape, and I kind of want to go up here, and this is where I'm moving around the images through this. So I'm being pointed over here, and I guess one thing that I would say is that I do feel like I want more of a payoff. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening here, a lot of interesting stuff happening here in these lines, but they're so densely packed and all this stuff is fairly evenly distributed that I don't really land anywhere in here. And the way that you've opened up space out here kind of, it almost like it sets the stage for something to go on right there. Anyway, I think that's kind of my general, just looking at this, I kind of feel like I got to stop using kind of, sort of thinking, but I'm being guided from this yellow spot right here, which is, contrasted with that. It's a light value color and it's next to a cool color. So that punches right there. And then I kind of travel over here and land over here. I don't know. I just feel like there's this stage being set for something more exciting, or more of a payoff to be happening over there. That could be maybe little punches of saturated color. It could be little squiggles of line. But again, it's like I'm waiting for the firework to go off, and my eye is like, I know the fireworks are going to happen right there, and I want something to happen, or I'm kind of holding my breath, waiting for something to happen right there. I think you could, I don't know, one idea that's coming to mind is I'm going to take the dodge tool. You could kind of gradually get lighter and lighter until we get to this spot right over here. Again, to kind of just dig in and make that even stronger, that pull to this area over here. Possibly kind of contrary to what I was saying earlier about atmospheric perspective, you could darken these areas around that light spot. So maybe even just really leaning into that being the focal point, making it lighter, making more contrast, and generally just giving us more of a payoff in that this whole area is stronger. So it really is, it's kind of this glow right here that I land on. It's kind of a peaceful area, or kind of a respite from all this chaos that's happening, or all this aggressive texture that's happening around. Or you could do something like, bring in, you could even bring in continue some of these lines that are happening in this texture, and kind of connect both sides of that. Yeah, I don't even know how I can do this. But if that makes sense. So now I've got this, you've got all these greens and cool colors, and then I've got this mass of warm lines, and high contrast and saturated color that makes this area that you're guiding me to more exciting. Like there's something going on there. Anyway, so looking, unfortunately, I painted over the original, so I don't have that to point us to. But I'm going to. So this is the original image. I think you could leave it as is. I like a lot of, just as usual with this artist's work, just a tremendous amount of really interesting things happening in terms of how she's bringing some of the negative space shapes and making them positive. So there's kind of reversal of positive and negative happening. And the lines and the texture and the way these collage elements divide up the space. There's a lot of really nice stuff happening in this image, and I don't, or in this composition. I don't think you necessarily need to change anything. I think I've just kind of you've seen it in real time. I've talked myself into feeling like I'm kind of wanting this whole area either to be emphasized more. So there's more of a feeling of like, aha, I've arrived at where she wanted me to arrive, or give us more of a payoff in some kind of event happening there. So when I get there, there's a sense of, okay, you led me here, and this is awesome. This is something exciting is happening. All right. So enough said. I think both images are really great. There's a lot of really nice stuff happening in both of them, and it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be looking at them and talking about them. Okay, so I'm going to switch over back over here. So let's see. So thank you for joining me for this live critique. If you want your image to be critiqued, you can email me at dabbleon@gmail.com. And if you are interested in future classes, my next series of my next 5-week class will be beginning in a couple weeks. You can go to dabbleon.com. That's where I will be posting information. That's where you can also subscribe to my email list if you want more information in the future. And I'd love to have you join the class. The next time around, or this next class, we're going to be talking or digging deeper into using resin in your artwork. So if you're interested in resin, this would be a good time to learn about it. And again, that's more information, and to sign up for my email list, you can go to Dabbleon. That's DABBLEON.com. Send images for this live critique to dabbleon@gmail.com. And with that, my friends, I will see you all next week.